The Custodian's Confession. There are rooms beneath London that have no name, only the scent of old paper, wax, and stone. For 40 years I walked their corridors, not as a scholar, not as a believer, but as a custodian. My duty was to clean, to repair, to copy what was allowed to survive. But among the permitted pages, there were others, those marked with a single sigil, the compass and the light. They did not belong to the church, nor to any crown. They belonged to the brotherhood. We called it the fraternity of the architects, though the world knows them by another name, the Masons. People speak of them as builders of cathedrals, of revolutions, of nations, but what they truly built was something far greater, an invisible empire of thought, geometry, and silence. I never asked to know their secrets, yet secrets have a way of finding those who stand too long in the shadows. Now, in the dusk of my years, I find that the silence of these halls weighs heavier than confession. The letters, the maps, the codes, they are still there, sealed in drawers that carry the scent of burnt oil and dust. I do not speak to accuse, nor to defend. I speak because the truth, like light, was never meant to remain locked beneath stone. What I am about to tell you was not written in any book. It was carved, in symbols, in whispers, in the very walls of Europe. This is their story. The story of those who shaped the modern world, and hid their blueprints in eternity. The builders of cathedrals. They say the first stones of Europe's cathedrals were placed not by kings, but by hands that never signed their names. In the 12th century, across France, England, and the German states, a silent brotherhood of craftsmen began to move from city to city, following the rhythm of stone, light, and faith. They were the magistri lapidem, masters of the stone. To them, geometry was not a science. It was prayer made visible. The perfect circle was divine order. The triangle, the trinity of all things. And every cathedral was a map of heaven, built on the ground. They spoke a language of signs, a handshake, a symbol carved behind an altar, a word whispered under scaffolding. Their oaths were not written, only memorized, and passed from apprentice to master like a secret flame. The church paid them. The kings protected them. Yet neither truly understood them. For they built not only for God, but for the idea of perfection itself. Inside the heart of each cathedral, behind the marble and the glass, they left messages for those who could see. A compass hidden in a window, a star drawn into the pavement, a carved eye that watches in eternal silence. The Masons knew that someday faith would falter, empires would crumble, and kings would fall. But geometry, pure, eternal, incorruptible, would remain. And so their brotherhood survived where others vanished. They built cathedrals, but they were not priests. They served God, but they worshipped knowledge. In the dust of stone and the echo of hammers, a philosophy was being born, one that dared to see the divine not in heaven, but in the harmony of human hands. The church saw devotion. The Masons saw design. And between those two visions, the first cracks of a greater secret began to form. Centuries later, those cracks would widen, and the world would finally glimpse what had been hidden in the geometry of faith. From stone to spirit. By the dawn of the 17th century, the sound of hammers had grown quiet. The great cathedrals of Europe stood complete, their spires piercing the heavens, their shadows stretching across a continent that had begun to doubt its own faith. The Masons had no more stones to set, no more arches to raise. Yet within their abandoned lodges, something refused to die. The geometry they once carved into marble began to take a new form, not of structure, but of idea. In taverns and candlelit halls from Edinburgh to London, small groups of former builders gathered in secret. They brought no blueprints, no chisels, no tools, only questions. If God is the great architect, they asked, then what are we? Are we his servants, or his reflections? Can a man build perfection within himself, as once he built it in stone? And so the first speculative lodges were born. The word Freemason no longer meant the laborer of stone, but the builder of a moral temple within the human soul. Their rituals changed. The compass became a symbol of reason. The square, of virtue. The level, of equality before the Creator. They studied the secrets of Egypt, of Solomon's temple, of the ancient mysteries. Alchemists, scholars, and noblemen joined their ranks. What began as a guild of hands had become a society of minds. And yet, the oaths remained. The silence. The signs. The passwords whispered across borders and centuries. In the year 1717, four lodges met in a London tavern and formed the first Grand Lodge of England, the moment when secrecy became organization, and philosophy became power. Outside, the world was changing, science challenging scripture, monarchs trembling before new ideas. Inside, the brethren drew their symbols in chalk upon the floor, erased them with a trowel, and swore that truth must be veiled in allegory, lest the unprepared mistake light for fire. Thus was born a new kind of faith, one without altars, without dogma, where the temple was the mind itself. The Masons no longer built for kings. They built for humanity. And though their lodges glowed with the light of reason, they also cast the longest of shadows. For wherever knowledge is bound by oath, power soon follows. And power, when hidden, does not fade, it multiplies. The invisible network. By the middle of the 18th century, Europe was no longer a land of cathedrals but of ideas. The kings ruled in palaces, but the minds of men began to belong to something far less visible. Across the continent, lodges multiplied, in London's smoky taverns, beneath the salons of Paris, in the candlelit chambers of Vienna and Prague. Each met under the same sign, the blazing star, the unfinished temple, the all-seeing eye. In every lodge, men of different nations and creeds called one another brother. A Frenchman clasped hands with an Englishman, a Catholic with a skeptic, a noble with a tradesman. For the first time in centuries, hierarchy bent before the ideal of equality, not proclaimed in the streets, but whispered across marble tables. Philosophers found refuge among them. Astronomers and alchemists exchanged equations beside merchants and diplomats. They spoke of light, reason, and the perfection of man. But they also spoke of influence, of the need to guide humanity away from ignorance, even if humanity resisted. What began as fellowship grew into a network. Letters crossed borders sealed with strange symbols, triangles, suns, serpents biting their tails. Messages disguised as architectural drawings were sent through couriers who did not know what they carried. Lodges were not armies, but they moved with the discipline of one. They gathered information, funded scholars, advised ministers. Their members sat in universities, parliaments, and courts. In Paris, a lodge discussed the writings of Rousseau and Voltaire. In Boston, another spoke of liberty and self-rule. What had been born from geometry had become ideology. And in that quiet transformation, a dangerous balance was broken. When light grows too bright, it blinds. Not all lodges sought harmony. Some pursued influence for its own sake. Hidden within the brotherhood arose factions, those who dreamed not of enlightenment, but of dominion. The church began to notice. Monarchs grew uneasy. And for the first time in centuries, the invisible builders felt the gaze of power turn upon them. Yet their web was already too vast to be undone. In letters written in invisible ink, they referred to themselves not as Masons, but as architects of the invisible empire. To the world, they were philosophers and philanthropists. To each other, they were something far older, the keepers of the eternal blueprint. The blueprint not of buildings, but of civilization itself. The language of symbols. Every brotherhood needs a language, one that speaks not to the ear, but to the eye. For the Masons, that language was geometry. The compass, the square, the blazing star, each line and curve a fragment of a hidden grammar that joined heaven and earth. To the outsider, they were tools of a builder. To the initiated, they were letters of a sacred alphabet. The circle meant eternity, the point within it, the divine spark within man. The square stood for the moral foundation, and the triangle, the harmony of intellect, spirit, and matter. In the cathedrals of France, one can still find these shapes carved beneath the choir stalls. In the palaces of Vienna, mosaics repeat them in silent rhythm. In the very plan of Washington, D.C., the avenues cross to form a compass and a star. It is said that if you trace the streets of Paris or the chambers of Westminster, you will find the same proportions, not by coincidence, but by design. For centuries, artists, mathematicians, and kings commissioned masons to build in stone what others could only imagine in ink. Their buildings were sermons in symmetry. The light that enters through a Gothic window does not fall by chance. It follows the same ratios that guide the stars. In every masterpiece of the Renaissance, from Da Vinci's sketches to Poussin's landscapes, echoes of Masonic geometry whisper beneath the surface. But symbols, once released into the world, no longer belong to their creators. The compass that once measured the perfection of God, began to measure the perfection of man. And so the meaning shifted. What had been a prayer became a doctrine. What had been the search for order became the pursuit of control. Kings began to decorate their halls with Masonic imagery they did not understand. Revolutionaries adopted the symbols as banners of reason and rebellion. The same star that crowned the lodges now adorned flags. The same eye that watched over the Masons now appeared on coins, seals, and nations. The Brotherhood had built its language too well. Its meaning escaped into the world, and the world spoke it without knowing what it said. For those who could still read, every cathedral, every capital, every monument became a page in a single, unfinished book. A book not of history, but of design. The Age of Revolutions. In the closing years of the 18th century, the lodges no longer whispered. Their words had escaped into the streets. What had once been oaths of brotherhood became slogans of liberty. Across Europe and the New World, the air trembled with the same phrase: freedom, equality, fraternity. It was not born in the palaces of kings, nor on the steps of cathedrals, but in meeting halls lit by oil lamps and guarded silence. In Paris, philosophers and Masons debated the perfect architecture of society, a structure without masters or servants, measured only by reason. In Boston, brothers gathered under the same symbols, speaking of independence, of a republic guided not by birth but by light. The blueprint had left the temple. It was now being built in blood. The French Revolution tore through thrones and altars alike. Some lodges dissolved in the chaos, others quietly steered events behind the curtain. Ministers, generals, even the architects of the guillotine, all shared the same initiations, the same secret handshakes. And as the heads of kings fell, the compass and square gleamed upon the banners of the New World. In America, the dream took another shape, a republic designed as a living lodge, the Capitol a temple, the eye above the pyramid a symbol of divine reason. Nations rose upon the very geometry that once built cathedrals. But freedom, like fire, cannot be owned. It burns whatever holds it. Soon, new powers rose from the ashes, men who spoke of equality yet ruled through secrecy. The church watched in alarm. Thrones whispered of conspiracy. And even within the brotherhood, a question began to echo: had they awakened humanity, or merely replaced one hierarchy with another? In their quest to liberate the world, the Masons had built a network so vast that no man could claim to control it. From the salons of Paris to the founding halls of Washington, the same symbols shone, but behind each symbol, a different intent. For some, the light was knowledge. For others, it was power. And in that divergence, the harmony that had once bound the brotherhood began to fracture. As Europe bled and empires collapsed, the Masons learned the oldest lesson of creation, that even the purest design, once brought into the world, can no longer choose what it becomes. The Church strikes back. In the wake of revolution, the smell of smoke and ink lingered over Europe. Thrones were broken, crowns melted into coins, and for the first time in 1,000 years, the Church was no longer the loudest voice in the world. From Rome, whispers rose. Who were these builders who claimed to replace faith with reason? Popes called them heretics in velvet gloves, priests without altars. The word Freemason became a sin spoken through teeth. In 1738, Pope Clement XII issued the first bull against them, In Eminentia Postulatus. It warned of secret oaths, foreign alliances, and men who met under the guise of charity to plot against heaven itself. Yet for every band that echoed from St. Peter's, another lodge opened its doors in silence. The more Rome condemned, the more the brotherhood grew. By the time of the French Revolution, the Vatican saw in their symbols not geometry, but rebellion. The compass and square were no longer tools, they were insignia of defiance. Priests preached that Lucifer himself had founded the lodges. Pamphlets spoke of a grand conspiracy to dismantle Christendom. Inside the walls of the Vatican, commissions were formed to collect intelligence on Masonic circles. Letters were intercepted, members excommunicated, funerals denied. But even within Rome, a paradox grew. Some cardinals suspected that within the forbidden teachings lay truths about creation that the Church had once buried itself. A few priests, quietly, at night, studied the Masonic texts they were ordered to burn. They found in them a mirror of their own doctrine, order, balance, light from darkness. The papal archives began to fill with reports marked Societas Architectonum. In their pages, fear and fascination walked side by side. Some believed the church should destroy the brotherhood. Others believed it should join it, or at least, understand its methods. For if the Masons had truly learned to shape the human mind as once they shaped stone, then their knowledge was not heresy, it was power. By the mid-19th century, papal agents and Masonic diplomats were meeting in secret. One offered absolution, the other, information. Their correspondence spoke in parables. Two temples stand upon one foundation. Only one may see the sun. The conflict between Rome and the Lodge was no longer a war of faith, but of architecture. Who would design the soul of the modern world? In the end, both built their altars. One in marble, one in mind. And between them rose a generation that believed in neither, but borrowed from both. The architects of the empire. The 19th century opened with a hum of machines and the scent of iron. The age of faith had ended, the age of empires had begun. Steamships replaced processions, factories replaced monasteries. But even as the world forged a new god in progress, another order guided its hand. The lodges did not vanish when the revolutions burned out, they adapted. No longer a refuge for dreamers, they became a network for rulers. Princes, bankers, scientists, ministers, all gathered under the compass and the square. They no longer built cathedrals of stone, they built institutions. Masonic lodges advised monarchs, funded railways, designed schools. They sat behind the first banks of Switzerland, in the ministries of London and Berlin, in the salons where colonies were drawn on maps. In their meetings, the vocabulary of faith was replaced by the language of economics. Equilibrium became balance sheets. Harmony became order. Light became progress. Yet the rituals remained, candles, oaths, the ancient geometry traced on the lodge floor before every meeting. Some saw it as tradition. Others, as the binding thread that held together an empire the world could not see. The British Empire, the Habsburg court, the Ottoman elite, all carried men who shared the same secret greetings. Diplomacy moved through corridors of marble, but the real negotiations were sealed with handshakes taught in lodges centuries earlier. The brothers spoke of a world united not by kings or clergy, but by knowledge. A network of enlightened men guiding the chaos of nations toward reason. It sounded noble. But reason, once enthroned, can be as merciless as faith. When the factories rose and the colonies expanded, the same compasses that once drew cathedrals now divided continents. In Africa and Asia, Masonic engineers surveyed land in the name of civilization. In Europe, their patrons financed wars to maintain balance. They believed themselves impartial, servants of progress. Yet progress, untempered by conscience, became conquest. In secret minutes of certain lodges, one finds phrases that chill even now. We must guide without ruling, rule without being seen. The lodges had mastered the one art no empire could survive without, the art of invisibility. The Masons were no longer the builders of an invisible empire. They were its governors. And for the first time, their architecture reached beyond cathedrals or nations. They began to design the future itself. The shadow within. By the dawn of the 20th century, the world the Masons had helped design was coming apart. Empires crumbled beneath the weight of their own machinery, and the brotherhood, once united by silence, began to divide in speech and in purpose. In the First World War, brothers faced one another across trenches, each wearing the insignia of a nation, not of a lodge. Some whispered passwords before dying, hoping their enemy might grant a final act of mercy in the name of a shared oath. After the war, Europe lay in ruins, yet amid the ashes, the lodges met again. They spoke of rebuilding, of a new order founded on reason and cooperation. But other voices whispered different words. In Germany, Italy, Spain, movements rose that despised secrecy and exalted obedience. To them, the Masons were relics of decadence, enemies of purity and nation. Lodges were closed, archives seized, members imprisoned or executed. Yet paradoxically, among the architects of those same regimes were men who had once stood in the circle of light. Some betrayed their vows for power. Others believed they could steer darkness toward a greater good. The compass and square appeared even within the symbols of tyranny, distorted, disguised, yet unmistakable. In the Vatican, new files filled the shelves, Societas Masonica, Periculosa. In occupied Paris, a handful of brothers met in basements lit by a single candle, swearing that the true temple of man must be rebuilt, not in marble, but in conscience. When the Second World War ended, Europe emerged not purified, but haunted. Some lodges had collaborated, others had died resisting. The brotherhood had become a mirror of humanity itself, divided, fallible, and wounded. They gathered again, now older, fewer, their rituals quieter, their faith uncertain. The questions that once guided them, about perfection, about light, now seemed almost naive in the shadow of genocide. One Grand Master wrote in 1948, "We sought to build the temple of reason. We found that reason alone cannot save a man from himself." In those words lay the silent confession of an age. The Masons had survived emperors, popes, revolutions, but not themselves. The invisible empire still existed, but its light was dimmed, its purpose fractured into countless lodges, each convinced it alone remembered the original design. Some turned to charity, others to politics, a few to mysticism. And through the 20th century's storms, through cold wars and secret agencies, through economic unions and new technologies, their symbols remained carved upon the buildings of power. Yet few who passed those doors knew what they meant. The brotherhood had become the very thing it once sought to guide, a system, vast and invisible, still moving long after the architects had gone. The veil of the modern age. By the end of the 20th century, the world had outgrown its temples. The old lodges stood empty, their banners faded, their oaths forgotten except by a few aging hands. Yet the principles they carried, connection, order, control, did not disappear. They simply changed form. What once required candlelight and cipher now needed only code. The compass became the algorithm. The square became the circuit board. The all-seeing eye no longer gazed from a fresco, it blinked from every screen. Power had left the marble halls and migrated into networks, invisible, borderless, faster than thought. In the first years of the new millennium, new brotherhoods emerged, not of stonecutters, not of philosophers, but of engineers, financiers, and architects of data. They spoke not of morality or geometry, but of access and information. The same dream returned in another language, a world perfectly measured, perfectly connected, perfectly known. Yet perfection, once again, demanded obedience. The silent lodges of the past had guarded their secrets from the uninitiated. The digital lodges of the present guard them through complexity, algorithms so vast that even their makers cannot see their boundaries. The ideal of universal brotherhood now echoes in social networks, but behind the rhetoric of openness lies the same architecture of control, the same desire to build order from chaos, the same blindness to the cost of perfection. In boardrooms and data centers, initiates of a new age sit beneath symbols they no longer recognize. Their rituals are quarterly reports, their scriptures, lines of code. But the geometry has not vanished. It has merely moved from cathedrals to circuits, from marble to silicon. Somewhere, perhaps in an old lodge beneath London or in a forgotten archive of Geneva, the original tools still rest: compass, square, level, untouched. Their metal dulled but their purpose intact. They remind us that the line between knowledge and domination has never changed. Only the tools have. The Brotherhood still exists, not as an organization, but as a pattern. Whenever men attempt to shape the world according to perfect design, the Masons rise again, not in name, but in spirit. The Custodian's Burden. I have spent my life among papers that no one was meant to read. Their ink has outlived their authors, their wax seals crumbled into dust. Sometimes, when I hold them to the light, I wonder whether they are looking back at me. I was young when I entered the archives, a clerk with steady hands and no questions. They told me I would be serving knowledge. I did not realize that knowledge, too, demands obedience. For decades I catalogued the correspondence of kings and architects, of popes and philosophers. I traced the fingerprints of men who built the world and erased their own names. I saw plans for cities never built, treaties never signed, manifestos written in cipher, addressed to generations unborn. I saw the same symbols reappear across centuries, drawn by different hands, yet guided by the same invisible geometry. At first, I believed I was preserving history. Now I understand I was guarding silence. There were nights when I wanted to burn it all, to scatter the ashes and let humanity begin again without the weight of its own secrets. But I never did. Because I learned that destruction is only another form of concealment. The true burden of the custodian is not what he keeps hidden, but what he understands too late. The Masons, the monarchs, the priests, they all sought the same thing: to impose order upon the infinite. And I, the keeper of their traces, have come to see the futility of it. The light they worshipped was never theirs to control. It shines through the cracks of every vault, through every sealed drawer, through the trembling hands of an old man who can no longer pretend that silence is virtue. I do not ask forgiveness. I ask only that when the doors finally open, those who enter remember that what they seek is not truth, but reflection. For every secret kept in these halls, there is another kept in the human heart, and sometimes, that is the darker of the two. The light that never fades. Dawn always finds its way into the archives. Even here, beneath stone and iron, the first rays slipped through cracks in the ceiling, touching the parchment as if to remind it that nothing written lasts forever. I watched the light crawl across the floor where countless men once stood, builders, dreamers, believers, skeptics. They all sought the same illumination. Some found it in scripture, others in science, others still in silence. But light, I've learned, is not the reward of certainty. It is the presence of doubt that refuses to die. The Masons called it the Great Architect. The priests called it God. The philosophers called it reason. And I, who have known them all only through their words, call it simply the search. I have seen men destroy kingdoms to defend their version of it. I have seen others die to protect a single spark of it. Yet it endures, indifferent to who claims it. Perhaps the invisible empire they built was never meant to rule the world, but to remind us that we are all builders, of meaning, of memory, of fragile order within the vast chaos that holds us. The compass and the square, the candle and the code, these are only echoes of the same desire, to measure what cannot be measured, to bring form to the infinite. As I set down my pen for the last time, I understand that secrecy was never the sin. Forgetting was. The light does not fade because it is hidden, it fades because we stop looking for it. Somewhere above me, a bell begins to toll. The hour matters little, only the sound. For in every echo of that bell, I hear the rhythm of the architects, still building, still questioning, still drawing the blueprints of eternity. And as the light climbs the walls, I whisper what they all must have whispered, standing before their unfinished temple, let there be light. The mirror of the architect. They say every design reflects its creator. And if man was made in the image of the great architect, then every temple, every city, every algorithm, is but a reflection of his own geometry. I have walked among ruins and skyscrapers alike, and I have learned that progress is only the echo of memory. We build because we cannot bear the void. We measure because we fear the infinite. The Masons believed the world could be perfected by symmetry. But what if imperfection was the truest form of creation? What if the crack in the marble is the only proof that it is real? In the archives, I once found a fragment written in Latin, non est opus perficiendum. Homo est opus. The work is not to perfect the temple. Man is the work. Perhaps that is the final secret of the brotherhood, that the temple they sought to build was never of stone, nor reason, nor code, but of conscience. A cathedral of compassion, hidden not beneath London or Rome, but within each man who dares to look at himself, and still choose to build. The final blueprint. There is a story, older than any lodge, that when the first mason laid his stone, he whispered not a prayer, but a promise. I build not for kings, nor gods, but for those who will come after, that they may find in my work a trace of their own. That promise was never broken. From cathedrals to circuits, from hands to machines, the human desire to shape the world has never ceased. And perhaps, that is the truest light, not the light that reveals, but the one that guides. The Masons may be gone, their symbols weathered, their secrets dust. Yet the geometry endures, in the way a child arranges stones by the river, in the way a poet measures silence between words, in the way we reach for order within chaos. The blueprint of eternity was never hidden. It was written in us. And so the circle closes, not in darkness, but in understanding. Light, after all, does not fade. It waits.